Good morning. I want to begin today by acknowledging the extraordinary moment we find ourselves in, not merely as economists, not merely as policymakers, but as stewards of a global trading architecture that took decades to build and that is now, with considerable speed and considerable consequence, being tested in ways that many of us hoped we would never have to witness in our professional lifetimes. What is unfolding between the United States, Canada, and China is not simply a headline. It is not a diplomatic skirmish that will resolve itself quietly over a weekend of back-channel negotiations. What we are witnessing is a fundamental realignment of North American trade relationships, a recalibration of trust between long-standing allies, and a strategic acceleration of Canadian economic independence that carries with it profound implications for American workers, American exporters, and the long-term credibility of United States trade policy on the world stage. Let me be precise about what has occurred because precision matters enormously in moments like this. Canada and China have formalized a trade arrangement valued at $47 billion. That number is not symbolic. It is not aspirational. It is a concrete, contractually anchored commitment that spans multiple commodity sectors, including natural resources, agricultural products, manufactured goods, and energy infrastructure. Sectors that, until very recently, were dominated by American export relationships with Canada and, through Canada, with broader global markets. $47 billion represents a reorientation of supply chains, a redirection of capital flows, and a political statement made in the language that international markets understand most clearly, the language of binding economic commitment. Now, I want to address the tariff policy that precipitated this moment because we cannot understand the Canadian response without first understanding the American provocation. The proposal to impose 100% tariffs on Canadian goods entering the United States, goods that, I must remind this audience, have flowed across our shared border under the framework of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, an agreement that this country negotiated, signed, and celebrated as a cornerstone of modern North American economic integration, represents a departure from the foundational principles that have governed our trade relationships for more than 3 decades. A 100% tariff is not a negotiating tool in any conventional sense. It is not a measured response to a documented trade imbalance. It is not the kind of targeted sector-specific instrument that responsible trade policy employs when genuine market distortions need to be corrected. A 100% tariff is, by any objective economic analysis, a trade prohibition. It is a declaration, dressed in the language of commerce, that we do not wish to do business with our closest neighbor and our largest trading partner on terms that are mutually beneficial. The economic literature on tariffs of this magnitude is unambiguous. When one country imposes prohibitive tariffs on another, particularly on a partner with whom it shares deeply integrated supply chains, the costs do not fall solely or even primarily on the targeted country. They are distributed, often unevenly, often unpredictably, across both economies. American manufacturers who rely on Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, Canadian lumber, Canadian agricultural inputs, and Canadian energy do not simply find alternative suppliers overnight. Global supply chains are not modular systems that can be reconfigured at the stroke of a policy pen. They are the accumulated result of years of investment decisions, logistics infrastructure, contractual relationships, and operational efficiencies that took generations to develop. When you disrupt them abruptly, you do not punish your trading partner. You punish your own industrial base. You punish your own workers. You punish the American businesses that built their operations on the reasonable assumption that the rules governing cross-border commerce would remain stable and predictable. And this is precisely what the data is beginning to show. Construction costs in the American Midwest have risen measurably in response to lumber supply disruptions. Energy costs in the northeastern United States, which have historically benefited from the proximity and affordability of Canadian natural gas and hydroelectric power, are trending upward. Agricultural input costs, particularly for fertilizers derived from Canadian potash, of which Canada controls a dominant share of global production, are climbing in ways that are beginning to affect farm level profitability across the Corn Belt and the wheat producing states of the Great Plains. These are not projections. These are emerging realities, and they are unfolding faster than the architects of this tariff policy appeared to anticipate. What Canada has done in response is precisely what any rational economic actor with options would do. It has exercised those options. The $47 billion agreement with China is not an act of aggression. It is not an emotional reaction or a diplomatic temper tantrum. It is a methodical, well negotiated pivot toward a market that has been actively courting Canadian commodities for years and that has the absorptive capacity, given its scale and its own developmental needs, to replace American demand across nearly every major Canadian export category. Canada has potash that China's agricultural sector needs. Canada has lumber and engineered wood products that China's construction industry can absorb. Canada has liquefied natural gas potential that China's energy transition strategy requires. Canada has high quality beef and grain products that China's growing middle class is increasingly demanding. The alignment of Canadian supply and Chinese demand was always latent. American trade policy has simply accelerated the formalization of that alignment by several years, perhaps by a decade. I want to take a moment here to speak about the concept of trade credibility because it is foundational to everything else I will say this morning. The United States has, for the better part of the post war era, served as the anchor of the rules based international trading system. We wrote many of those rules. We championed the institutions, the World Trade Organization, its predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the network of bilateral and multilateral trade agreements that gave those rules force and legitimacy. Other nations structured their economic policies, their investment decisions, and their diplomatic alignments around the expectation that the United States would behave as a predictable, consistent, and law abiding participant in the global trading system. That expectation was, for most of the post war period, justified. It was the foundation of American soft power. It was a competitive advantage that no other nation could easily replicate because it was built not on military strength or natural resource abundance, but on institutional reliability and the perceived sanctity of American commitments. When we impose 100% tariffs on a USMCA partner without a clear legal basis under the agreement's dispute resolution mechanisms, we do not merely damage our relationship with Canada. We send a signal to every nation that has structured its economic relationship with the United States on the assumption of that reliability. We tell them, in effect, that American commitments are contingent, that they are subject to revision at the discretion of the current administration without recourse, without process, and without the kind of transparent evidence-based justification that the rules-based system demands. And nations respond to that signal rationally. They begin to hedge. They begin to diversify. They begin to build the alternative relationships that protect them against the risk of American unpredictability. Canada's $47 billion agreement with China is, in this sense, not just a trade deal. It is a hedge. It is a very large, very consequential, very publicly visible hedge against the risk of continued American unreliability as a trading partner. Let us now turn our attention to the specific commodity dimensions of this realignment, because I believe it is essential that we move beyond the macroeconomic abstractions and examine, with the granularity that this moment demands, precisely which sectors of the American economy are being affected, how those effects are propagating through domestic supply chains, and what the medium-term consequences are likely to be for American workers, American businesses, and American communities that have built their economic identities around industries that are now being disrupted by a trade policy that was, in my considered judgment, neither carefully modeled nor adequately stress-tested before it was announced. The devil, as economists frequently observe, is always in the details, and in this particular case, the details are deeply structurally consequential. Begin with lumber. The United States and Canada share the most deeply integrated forest products supply chain in the world. Canadian softwood lumber has supplied American home builders, American renovation contractors, and American infrastructure developers for generations. Approximately 30% of the lumber consumed in the United States in any given year originates in Canadian forests, primarily in British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec. This is not a marginal supply relationship. It is a load-bearing pillar of the American residential construction industry. When you impose prohibitive tariffs on Canadian lumber, you do not create an immediate domestic substitute. American lumber production capacity, while substantial, cannot be scaled rapidly enough to replace Canadian supply without multi-year investments in milling infrastructure, forestry management, and logistics networks. The result, which is already visible in forward pricing data for residential construction, is a meaningful increase in the cost of building a home in the United States. Estimates from the National Association of Home Builders and independent housing economists suggest that tariff-driven lumber cost increases could add between $9,000 and $14,000 to the cost of a median new single-family home. In a housing market that is already severely constrained by affordability challenges, a market where first-time homebuyers are already stretched to their limits by elevated mortgage rates and insufficient housing supply, this is not a marginal inconvenience. It is a structural barrier that will price additional American families out of homeownership and deepen the housing affordability crisis that has been one of the most persistent and politically significant economic challenges of the past several years. Canada, recognizing this leverage, has responded with characteristic pragmatism. Rather than absorbing the tariff impact and waiting for American policy to reverse course, Canadian lumber producers have accelerated their engagement with Chinese buyers, who have been expanding their appetite for high-quality North American softwood as China's own domestic forestry resources face sustainability constraints. The $47 billion agreement with China includes significant lumber and engineered wood product commitments that will, over the next 18 to 24 months, redirect a meaningful share of Canadian lumber production away from American markets and toward Pacific destinations. Once those supply relationships are established, once the logistics infrastructure is built, once the contractual commitments are in place, reversing course will not be a simple matter of lifting tariffs and expecting Canadian producers to return to American markets on their previous terms. Trade relationships, once disrupted, do not automatically reconstitute themselves. The Canadian lumber industry will have made capital investments, established customer relationships, and built operational capabilities oriented toward Asian markets. The costs of reorienting back toward the United States will be real, and Canadian producers will rationally demand assurances of policy stability before accepting the vulnerability that comes with renewed dependence on American market access. Now consider aluminum. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of aluminum to the United States, accounting for approximately 59% of American aluminum imports in recent years. American manufacturers in the automotive sector, the aerospace industry, the beverage packaging industry, the construction sector, and a wide range of advanced manufacturing applications rely on Canadian aluminum as a cost-competitive, high-quality input that is not readily substitutable from domestic sources at current production capacity levels. The United States does not have sufficient primary aluminum smelting capacity to replace Canadian supply. This is a structural reality that reflects decades of investment decisions shaped by energy costs, environmental regulations, and the economics of global aluminum production. Domestic aluminum production is energy intensive in ways that make it particularly sensitive to electricity pricing, and the regions of the United States with the lowest electricity costs do not have the infrastructure, the workforce, or the environmental permitting frameworks to rapidly expand primary smelting capacity in response to tariff-driven supply disruptions. The consequences of aluminum supply disruption are not confined to the industries that directly consume the metal. They propagate through supply chains in ways that affect employment, investment, and competitiveness across a remarkably broad range of American industries. An automotive manufacturer that faces higher aluminum input costs does not simply absorb those costs and maintain its pricing. It passes them through to consumers, reducing vehicle affordability and potentially suppressing demand. It evaluates its production cost structure relative to foreign competitors who may have access to lower cost aluminum inputs, potentially affecting decisions about where to locate future manufacturing investment. It may reduce employment at American facilities to offset cost increases, creating labor market consequences that are distributed across communities far removed from the original policy decision. These second and third order effects are not speculative. They are the predictable, well documented consequences of supply disruption in deeply integrated manufacturing supply chains. And they are the reason that trade economists consistently emphasize the importance of distinguishing between the intended effects of a tariff policy and its actual systemic economic consequences. Canada's response in the aluminum sector has been equally strategic. Canadian aluminum producers, led by companies with significant production capacity in Quebec, where abundant hydroelectric power provides a structural cost advantage that is essentially irreplaceable, have been in active discussions with Chinese buyers, European manufacturers, and other Asian industrial consumers about long-term supply arrangements that would reduce their dependence on American market access. The $47 billion China agreement includes aluminum supply commitments that represent a meaningful reorientation of Canadian production capacity. And here, the strategic calculus is particularly clear. Canadian aluminum produced with clean hydroelectric power carries an environmental premium that is increasingly valued by manufacturers facing carbon accounting obligations and sustainability commitments. Chinese manufacturers, European automakers, and Asian electronics producers all have reasons to prefer low-carbon aluminum, and Canadian producers are well positioned to supply it. American tariff policy has, in effect, accelerated the process by which Canadian aluminum producers are establishing themselves as preferred suppliers to the global clean manufacturing economy, a competitive position that will generate long-term commercial benefits for Canada that persist well beyond any eventual resolution of the current trade dispute. Potash deserves particular attention in this analysis because it represents perhaps the most strategically significant commodity dimension of the Canada-China agreement, and because its implications for American agriculture are both severe and insufficiently appreciated in mainstream policy discussions. Canada controls approximately 31% of global potash reserves and is consistently among the world's 2 or 3 largest potash producers. Potash is the essential ingredient in the fertilizers that sustain crop yields across the American agricultural heartland. Without adequate potash application, corn yields in Iowa, wheat yields in Kansas, and soybean yields across the Mississippi River Basin would decline materially. There is no domestic American substitute for Canadian potash at anything approaching current production volumes. The Carlsbad Potash District in New Mexico and the small number of other American potash-producing regions are capable of supplying only a fraction of American agricultural demand. The remainder must be imported, and Canada has historically been the dominant supplier. When Canada formalizes a long-term potash supply agreement with China, a country whose agricultural sector is the largest in the world by cultivated area and whose demand for potash fertilizers is enormous and growing. The implications for American agriculture are direct and serious. If Canadian potash producers are contractually committed to supplying Chinese buyers at volumes that approach the limits of their production capacity, American agricultural buyers will face either reduced supply availability, higher prices, or both. The fertilizer cost increases that American farmers are already beginning to experience as a consequence of trade uncertainty will be amplified and extended if the Canada-China potash arrangements reduce the flexibility of Canadian producers to respond to American demand fluctuations. Farm-level profitability in the Corn Belt and the wheat-producing states will be squeezed from both directions by higher input costs driven by potash supply tightening and by potential export market disruptions if retaliatory trade measures affect American agricultural exports to third country markets. This is the economic reality that the architects of the 100% tariff policy appear not to have modeled with sufficient rigor. Trade policy does not operate in a vacuum. It operates in a world of rational actors with options, and when you make it sufficiently costly for your trading partners to maintain their existing commercial relationships with you, they will exercise those options. Canada has exercised its options. The $47 billion agreement with China is the most visible and most consequential expression of that exercise, but it is not the only one. Canada has simultaneously been deepening its trade relationships with the European Union, with Japan, with South Korea, with India, and with a range of emerging market economies that are actively seeking to diversify their supply chains away from dependence on any single dominant trading partner. The United States, through its tariff policy, has accelerated every one of those diversification efforts and has done so at a moment when its own economic interests would have been far better served by consolidating and deepening the North American economic integration that has been a source of competitive strength for all three USMCA partners. I want to spend considerable time in this portion of my remarks addressing the geopolitical dimensions of what is unfolding, because I believe that the trade and economic analysis, as important as it is, captures only a portion of the full strategic significance of the Canada China Agreement and the American tariff policy that precipitated it. We are not simply witnessing a commercial dispute between neighboring economies. We are witnessing a moment of genuine geopolitical realignment, a moment in which the assumptions that have governed North American strategic and economic relationships for the better part of 3 decades are being fundamentally interrogated, and in which the answers that are emerging have implications that will shape the architecture of global economic power for years, perhaps for decades, to come. As someone who has spent her career at the intersection of economic policy and institutional design, I find this moment both analytically fascinating and deeply concerning, and I think it is my responsibility to speak about it with the full candor that the situation demands. Let us begin with the strategic context of the Canada China relationship, because it is important to understand that this relationship did not materialize overnight in response to American tariff pressure. Canada and China have been developing their economic relationship gradually and deliberately for many years. The two countries established a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement framework. They have engaged in exploratory free trade discussions at various points, and Canadian businesses across a range of sectors, from resource extraction to financial services to agricultural exports, have been building commercial relationships with Chinese counterparts that reflect genuine complementarity between Canadian supply capabilities and Chinese demand requirements. What the American tariff policy has done is not create this relationship from nothing. It has dramatically accelerated its formalization, elevated its political salience, and increased its strategic depth. It has transformed what was a commercially driven, gradually developing economic relationship into a geopolitically significant strategic partnership, one that Canada is now actively cultivating not merely because it is commercially attractive, but because it provides essential strategic insurance against the risk of American economic coercion. This transformation has consequences that extend well beyond the bilateral Canada China relationship. Consider the signal it sends to every American ally and partner around the world. The United States has, for decades, asked its allies to accept certain costs and constraints in their economic relationships with China in the interest of maintaining a unified Western approach to managing China's economic rise and its implications for the rules-based international order. We have asked European partners to restrict Chinese investment in sensitive infrastructure sectors. We have asked Asian allies to limit their participation in Chinese-led multilateral financial institutions. We have asked developing country partners to prefer Western-backed development financing over Chinese Belt and Road alternatives. These asks have always been costly for the countries receiving them, and they have been accepted, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes incompletely, but accepted nonetheless, largely on the basis of trust in American leadership and confidence that the United States would reciprocate by maintaining its commitments to the alliance relationships and trade frameworks that give American partnership its value.